Once Fumi became their stepmother, her true nature was revealed. Once upon a time, in the city of Lagos, there lived a kind and handsome man named Mr. Oladele. Mr. Oladele was happily married to a beautiful woman named Adebisi, and they had two lovely daughters, Bola and Titi. They lived in a fancy house filled with laughter and love. However, their happiness was short-lived as tragedy struck, leaving the family broken and in tears. One fateful evening, Adebisi was driving home from work when a terrible accident occurred. A speeding car collided with her vehicle, and despite the best efforts of the doctors, Adebisi couldn't survive the injuries. The news of her death shattered Mr. Oladele and his daughters. Oh no. The once cheerful home turned into a place of sorrow and mourning. After Adebisi's burial, life became difficult for Mr. Oladele and his daughters. Bola and Titi missed their mother terribly, and Mr. Oladele struggled to balance work and taking care of his children. Seeing his distress, his secretary, a woman named Fumi, began to help out. She cooked meals, cleaned the house, and tried to bring some normalcy back into their lives. Fumi's constant presence and caring nature gradually drew Mr. Oladele closer to her. He appreciated her help and began to rely on her more and more. As time passed, Mr. Oladele and Fumi fell in love. Despite the objections of the daughters, who were still grieving their mother, Mr. Oladele decided to marry Fumi, believing she would be a good mother to Bola and Titi. The joy of a new marriage was short-lived for Bola and Titi. Once Fumi became their stepmother, her true nature was revealed. She stopped the girls from going to school, claiming they needed to help more at home. Fumi would often starve them and make them do heavy house chores while she rested. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months, but the situation only worsened for Bola and Titi. Fumi's cruelty knew no bounds. She would scold them harshly for minor mistakes, give them very little food, and force them to work from morning till night. The girls' once happy faces were now filled with sadness and fear. Despite witnessing the maltreatment of his daughters, Mr. Oladele remained oblivious to their suffering. Fumi had convinced him that the girls were being lazy and disobedient, and he believed her words over his daughters. The loving father they once knew seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a man who turned a blind eye to their pain. Bola and Titi felt trapped and helpless. They missed their mother dearly and longed for the days when they were happy and free. They tried to reach out to their father, but Mr. Fumi always managed to intercept their attempts. The girls' only solace was each other's company, and they would cling to the hope that one day their father would realize the truth. One dark night, after a particular harsh punishment from Fumi, Bola and Titi sat in their small cold room, whispering to each other. They were tired, hungry, and scared, but they knew they had to find a way out of this nightmare. They decided to run away and seek help from their mother's family, hoping they would take them in and protect them from Fumi. The girls spent the next few days secretly planning their escape. They gathered whatever little food they could find and saved it for their journey. They also packed a small bag with a few clothes and items that reminded them of their mother. Bola and Titi knew it would be dangerous, but they were determined to leave the house of horrors behind. One night, when Fumi was fast asleep, Bola and Titi quietly slipped out of their room and crept towards the door. Their hearts were pounding with fear, but they kept moving forward. Just as they reached the door, Fumi woke up and hurt them. Oh no. She was furious and dragged them back into the house. locking them in their room as punishments. Bola and Titi's hope began to fade. They realized that escaping from his clutches would be nearly impossible. They were too young and too weak to fight back, and their father was no longer the protector they once knew. The future looked grim, and they feared they would never be free from their wicked stepmother's grasp. Every night, Bola and Titi would cry themselves to sleep, their silent tears a testament to their suffering. They prayed for a miracle, hoping that someone would come to their rescue. But as days turned into months, their cries for help went unanswered. The love and warmth they once knew seemed like a distant memory, and the reality of their situation was a heavy burden on their young heart. Unknowingly to Bola and Titi, there was someone who had been watching their plight from afar. A neighbor, Mrs. Eze, had noticed the changes in the household and the sorrow in the girl's eyes. She had seen Fumi's harsh treatment and the girl's despair, but she was unsure how to help without causing more trouble for them. One evening, Mrs. Eze decided she could no longer stand by and watch the girls suffer. She gathered her courage and approached Mr. Oladele, hoping to make him see the truth. She told him about the abuse she had witnessed and begged him to protect his daughters. But Mr. Oladele, blinded by his trust in Fumi, dismissed Mrs. Eze's concern and accused her of meddling in his affairs. Fumi, hearing about Mrs. Eze's visits, was enraged. She took out her anger on Bola and Titi, punishing them even more harshly. The girls were at their breaking point, and their health began to deteriorate from the constant abuse and lack of proper care. They felt utterly alone, with no one to turn to for help. As the days grew darker, Bola and Titi's prayer for salvation remained unanswered. The hope that once kept them going was now replaced by a deep sense of despair, and their cries for help echoed in the empty corridors of their home. They longed for their mother's comforting presence and dreamed of a life free from pain and suffering. But reality was harsh, and their cries for help echoed in the empty corridors of their home. One night, as the girls lay in their cold, dark room, Titi had a dream. She saw her mother, Adebisi, standing before her, looking radiant and full of love. Adebisi spoke to Titi, telling her to stay strong and never lose hope. She promised that one day she would be free from their stepmother's cruelty. When Titi woke up, she shared the dream with Bola, and it gave them a gleam of hope, however faint. Despite the brief moments of hope, Bola and Titi's struggles continued. Fumi's cruelty showed no signs of abating, and their father's indifference was a constant source of heartbreak. They held onto each other, finding strength in their bond as sisters. But the weight of their suffering was becoming too much to bear. The community around them remained largely silent. While some, like Mrs. Eze, were aware of the situation, most chose to turn a blind eye. They feared getting involved, worried about the repercussions of standing up against Fumi. The girls felt abandoned by the very people who should have protected them. In a final desperate attempt to seek help, Bola wrote a letter to their maternal grandmother, explaining everything that had been happening. She secretly gave the letter to Mrs. Eze, hoping she would send it on their behalf. Mrs. Eze, moved by the girl's plea, promised to deliver the letter. Days turned into weeks as Bola and Titi anxiously awaited a response. They prayed that their grandmother would come to their rescue, but each passing day, without news, chipped away at their hope. Fumi's oppression continued unabated, and girls grew weaker and more despondent. Finally, the letter reached their grandmother, Mrs. Ajayi. Shocked and heartbroken by the news, she immediately made plans to visit her granddaughters. She hoped to take them away from the toxic environment and provide them with the love and care they desperately needed. When Mrs. Ajayi arrived at Mr. Oladele's home, she was horrified by the sight of her frail and fearful granddaughters. She confronted Fumi, demanding to take the girls with her. Fumi, however, refused, claiming she was their legal guardian now and that the girls were her responsibility. Witnessing the confrontation between the mother-in-law and his wife, Mr. Oladele began to see the truth. The realization of his daughter's suffering hit him like a tidal wave, and he felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and shame. He had failed to protect his beloved children, blinded by his trust in Fumi. Mr. Oladele finally decided to take action. He apologized to his daughters and promised to make things right. He agreed to let Mrs. Ajayi take Bola and Titi with her, hoping they would find the peace and happiness they deserved. For the first time in a long while, the girls felt a glimmer of hope. As Bola and Titi left with their grandmother, they looked back at the house that had been both their home and their prison. They knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it together. The bond they shared as sisters and their love for their mother gave them the strength to move forward. Though they were free from Fumi's immediate grasp, the scars of their ordeal remained. Bola and Titi struggled with the memories of their suffering and the betrayal by their father. They found solace in their grandmother's love and support, but the road to healing would be long and arduous. Unfortunately, the peace they found with their grandmother was short-lived. Fumi, driven by spite and a need for control, began to manipulate Mr. Oladele once again. She convinced him to bring the girls back, claiming that they belonged with their father and that she would change her ways. Reluctantly, Mr. Oladele agreed to bring Bola and Titi back home. The girls were devastated, knowing they were returning to the nightmare they had escaped. Despite their grandmother's protest, Mr. Oladele believed Fumi's promises and took his daughters back to the house of torments. As Bola and Titi walked back into their father's house, they felt the weight of despair settle over them once more. The hope that had briefly lit their hearts was extinguished, and they braced themselves for the cruelty that awaited them. The cycle of suffering seemed unbroken, and their future remained shrouded in darkness. The story of Bola and Titi is a tale of resilience and the unbreakable bond between sisters. Despite the cruelty they endured at the hands of their wicked stepmother, they held onto each other and the memory of their loving mother. Though their journey is fraught with hardship and pain, their story is far from over. The fight for their freedom and happiness continues, and they remain determined to find a way out of the darkness that has consumed their lives. The moral of this story is that Bola and Titi learned a very important lesson. They learned that even in the darkest times, they should never give up hope. They also learned that there are kind people in the world who will help when things are very hard. The most important lesson is that families should always love and protect each other. Another interesting story is dropping soon. Do well to subscribe to this channel if you're yet to do so, for you not to miss out on other stories. It is completely free. Thank you for staying with us. Bye.